Joining us from Wakefield is Baroness Warsi, a former Faith and Communities Minister and also a former co-chair of the Conservative Party, and rapper and TV chef Big Zoo from West London. Eid Mubarak, first of all, to you both.
Eid Mubarak. Eid Mubarak to you as well.
Now, let me come to you first, Saida. You woken up, you live in Wakefield, West Yorkshire. I don't know whether you had got the news last night before you went to bed. Many of us certainly didn't. You woke up this morning, mixed feelings. You've got Eid going on, but perhaps you can't now go and visit your family members.
Yeah, I think it's changed Eid plans for many, many people. We live just outside the lockdown area, which is covering Calderdale and Kirklees. But both my parents and my in-laws and children, siblings live in the area, which is impacted by the lockdown. So lots of plans that we had in place about how we were going to meet different members of the family at different times to make sure that social distancing was being preserved across the families has now been changed. And I think so lots and lots of disappointed people waking up this morning. And I think a sense that had we known and had there been a little bit more preparation, even if it had just been a day, then that would have been easier. Because as you know, Adil, so much preparation goes into Eid. The cooking and the arrangements and the planning starts days in advance. And yet this lockdown, I think, was only weeks, it was only hours before midnight when it was imposed.
Yeah, we're not quite entirely sure why that was, but do you have some sympathy? They've obviously looked at some research, they've been following some of the data. They've had to make a call at some point. And I think they've admitted in their command meeting, I think they call it, that actually the fact that it was Eid today had some bearing. They did take that under consideration, and they realised that maybe lots of families will be visiting each other. They had to make the decision at some point. Perhaps they've left it until the last minute to make sure they're making the decision on the information at the time.
I think faith communities, Adil, have handled the situation incredibly well across the board. We've had major moments in the faith calendar, including Easter and, of course, the month of Ramadan. And I've really got to pay tribute to community organisations, individuals, activists who have been making sure, including like yourself, putting out the message, making sure that the message is heard, making sure that all communities are playing their part. I think with the current lockdown, because it's still unclear, and I had phone calls right through to 1 a.m. Into the early hours of the morning saying, well, what does that mean? Because there's still not clarity on whether that means you can meet outdoors. Thankfully, there was some clarification that those mosques that had already prepared for COVID Eid prayers with the proper procedures in place would be allowed to go ahead. But I think the lack of clarity and the lateness of the message hasn't encouraged what effectively, I think, throughout the pandemic has been a community-wide response across the United Kingdom. People have voluntarily been part of this response. And I think it would have been better to have done this with a little bit more understanding and clarity to make sure that we kept that essential support for lockdown.
Okay. And it's interesting because somebody here, Sam, says on Twitter, I have deep sympathy for those Muslims not being able to celebrate Eid with their families. And he makes the point that the same might be true for Jewish people, for Hanukkah, Christians at Christmas. If we don't get this virus under control and aim for the zero COVID strategy, you know, as in we watch if we're not in those areas and think, goodness me, those poor people. But it could be, there are a list of 36 places across the country which are on this watch list. Big Zoo, let's talk to you, really. You know, for you, how important was and still is this weekend, and what are you doing differently?
It's obviously it's a massive day for all Muslims across the country, across the world. For me, it's not going to be too different because I'm lucky I'm celebrating at home with the family. So I'm not having to go out or have to follow any social distancing. But I do feel sorry for people that aren't able to see their family, but also I do understand and take in the fact that Eid is a day of reflection and appreciation. And I think people are going to have to take that into account, you know, in these kind of times. Yeah,
I mean, interesting, because we made the point in the message that this Eid, it's about sacrifice, isn't it? It's and actually, there's no greater sacrifice you could make at this point by sacrificing the privileges that you may well be used to at this time in order to protect yourself and others.
Oh, I think Biggs is... Although you were very familiar, you called him Biggs.
Biggs,
I noticed that.
I wasn't sure whether to call him Zoo or
right,
Biggs.
Yeah.
Saida, but coming to you, though, I mean, do you get a sense with the Muslim community, and this is not just the Muslim community, actually, I think this is all the community. There's some research that was done, I think The Guardian put it out earlier this week, actually, ever since the Barnard Castle incident, that actually people have been very confused as to what they can and cannot do. I mean, give an example, and, and this is why I don't want to single out a community, that, at the moment, travel to Spain is supposed to be essential travel, but we all know people that are going on holiday to Spain. People are making their own minds up. Has that been prevalent, do you think, in the Muslim community, that they've thought, well, actually, just visiting somebody's house down the road doesn't feel like a serious flouting of the rules, or if there's going to be 8 of us in the house rather than 6, or whatever it might be, it doesn't feel like it's as excessive as maybe going to the pub or going on holiday to Spain?
I think you're absolutely right, Adler. Look, the thing that makes us Brits, all of us together, is that sense of fair play. The reason why we queue so well is because we know that everybody else is going to queue. And unfortunately, I think what we needed and what we had overwhelmingly during this whole pandemic has been that sense of fair play, that we've all followed the same rules at the same time, and therefore we're all helping the national effort. But I think when we've had incidents like the Dominic Cummings affair that you mentioned, when we see beaches full of people who are clearly not social distancing, when we see pubs and clubs heaving, and when we even hear stories of illegal raves, I think at that point you have people of all backgrounds. I mean, we heard during Easter, Christians were concerned that actually they weren't being allowed to go and engage in prayer on such an important moment in the Christian calendar, and yet they could see other people were breaking the rules. So I think there has been a report out only in the last week to say that trust in politicians and trust in the process was dented after the Dominic Cummings affair. And I think it is important that when politicians expect us to follow the rules, that they too are seen to be abiding by them.
Yeah. Big Sue, I know you're back now. A question I actually want to put to you now is that, do you get a sense from people that you're speaking to, your friends, your family, your community, that there is an understanding of the rules? Do you think they're getting the information? Is there clarity, do you think?
I mean, it depends on your perception of the situation. I think different people believe in different things. It's hard to gauge exactly where we're at when the rules do change all the time. Like, you do have this new force of lockdown in the northwest of England. So it's tough. I think it really does depend on how much you kind of follow the news and keep your ear to the ground, because, people do have different understandings of what's going on, and I think it's affecting all types of communities.
Yeah, and I slightly worry, Zoo, that basically what happens is people get so confused or get actually frustrated. I mean, we as journalists, as broadcasters, sort of go, I can't get my head around this. That people maybe just give up and just go, well, I'm just going to do what I think is right.
Yeah, I think it's got to a point where I think a lot of people are like relying on their common sense and what they think is right for them. And I think it's just important that the rhetoric and the overall information that we receive in terms of how to stay safe in these kind of times is important, that it's consistent, and that people are staying safe, you know what I mean?
And just a final word from you, side of RC. You know that the government is now looking to employ a woman to handle these daily briefings, a bit like President Trump has a woman who does, every day she handles the press. I mean, you've been at the forefront of the Conservative Party. You are a woman and you're a very good communicator. Is it something you'd consider doing?
No, I think my days of speaking on behalf of the government are long gone. I'm focusing on other things, like making sure that my family get to celebrate Eid properly as well as we can within our homes.
Do you think it's a bit of a poisoned chalice taking that job on?
I think it's incredibly difficult to communicate messages sometimes when the messages themselves are not very clear or consistent. And therefore, I think this person will have a huge task, an important role to play in effectively acting as interpreter for sometimes messages that aren't consistent and aren't clear.
And do you think it's right that they should specifically look for a woman to do the job?
Well, no, I don't understand the reasoning for that. I think you just need
Boris has faced a lot of criticism, hasn't he? That, there's only Priti Patel. He seems to, when he sort of handed out all the honours and the peerages, there were hardly any women in there. He's faced a lot of... He's a man's man and doesn't really... I was going to say doesn't really embrace women, but I'll leave that to one side. It's a careful choice of words. But do you think it's right, then, that, that they should be focusing on a woman for this job?
Well, no, because I think sometimes communicators are simply instruments of policy. Policy is made elsewhere, and then communicators and spokespeople are used to tell people what that policy is. And what I've consistently said is that real power is where policy is made. So I'm not just interested in people being instruments of policy. I want them to be policy makers. And that means employing women not just to be communicators, but to essentially be part of the core decision making. And I think that's what I would like to see, not just window dressing.
Okay, well, I think applications are valid until August the 21st, so you've got some time to think about it. But thank you so much for joining us on the programme.